There we go. And let's see, I think I have to hide that. Not sure what you can see. Let's see. Start the slideshow. There we go. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have that picture.
Yes, I think a lot of us have that picture. That was from.
I remember. That's beautiful.
Yeah, a morning rainbow at Te Anu.
Okay, I'm
I'm
going
going to begin with.
everybody at this point.
Okay.
Are you ready for me to mute them?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with a help wanted advertisement.
We lost you, Marcia.
Marcia. Okay. I can't figure out how to unmute Marcia, and I can't find her on the list of participants.
I can see her, Sheila, but I can't unmute her either.
Okay, wait. I'm trying. Oh, here she is.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
We lost you right as you said you needed a help wanted something or other.
Yes. Okay. That's probably when Sheila muted everyone. Okay. We'll figure this out. I'm going to begin with a help wanted advertisement. As some of you know, besides being Pacific Northwest Chapter President, I'm also chair of AWG's Field Trip Committee. So I've been organizing or arranging AWG field trips off and on since 1986 and have been the primary organizer for at least 10 of them and have helped with several others. AWG aims to hold one field trip a year and sometimes two. And we generally try to alternate between North American trips and overseas trips. It's a fair amount of work, but the main advantage is that I largely get to choose where we go. This all works best when the committee has co-chairs and can alternate primary responsibility for each year's trip. My co-chair recently had to resign, so if you're interested in helping organize our field trips, please let me know. We have trips in the works through 2022, maybe longer if we can't run our Iceland trip next year. But we can always use suggestions, especially if they come with a geologic leader in mind. So our New Zealand trip was 2 full weeks starting in Auckland on the North Island and ending in Dunedin along the southeast coast of the South Island. Some of us came early or stayed later. The timing was such that we all left the U.S. aware of the oncoming pandemic and came home to a very different shut-down world. We basically got really lucky with the timing. A few weeks later, and we probably wouldn't have been able to do the trip at all. Our geologic leader, was Paul Ashley, who is Australian, but has done a lot of economic geology work in New Zealand over the decades. He developed the itinerary and was excellent at explaining the geology at stops. But best of all, he put together the best geologic field trip guidebook I've ever encountered, with a good background geology discussion and daily route maps on a geologic map background showing the stops, plus a lot of text and illustrations explaining what we were looking at, and I think just about all of the maps and figures in this talk are from that guidebook. Tom Williams was the main trip organizer. He helped Paul adapt the itinerary and made the logistical arrangements for lodgings and buses and all sorts of things. This is the second New Zealand trip that he's done with Paul, and they made several changes from their earlier trip to bring down the price for us. AWG's field trip to the northern San Andreas Fault will be with Williams GeoAdventures, but my role for this trip was more as a ranger for AWG, which is way easier than being the actual logistical organizer. Oops, twice. I wanted to talk a bit about the logistics since it's a real challenge for a trip this long and a group this large. The main changes that Tom and Paul made for us was to put us up at top 10 holiday parks for about 2/3 of the trip, and to set it up so that we ate breakfasts and lunches from groceries on those days and occasional other days. This wasn't just a lot cheaper for participants. It made our itinerary more flexible in that we didn't necessarily need to be near a town at lunchtime. It also made it easier not to gain 5 pounds over the course of the trip, which is my usual experience if we're eating entirely out of restaurants. Our food team did a lot of work between doing the grocery shopping, managing the coolers, and doing some food preparation, especially for the breakfasts. They were compensated with a break on the trip price. I'm not sure it was enough. Susan was on the trip, so she can talk about that. Is on this call. In cities, we stayed in hotels or motels, but the rest of the time we stayed in the top 10 holiday parks. I'd expected them to be, sort of like nicer hostels, but they're generally much better than that, with well-equipped kitchens and bathrooms. Beds were normally pretty good too, although if you go to New Zealand and want to stay in these places, I'd kind of give the classic ones a pass and stick to the premium and superior ones. We generally stayed 2 to 4 people in each unit and up to 5 in some of the multi-bedroom motel or hotel rooms. 5 was really kind of too many, I think. Except for our flight from Wellington to Christchurch, we rode in these really nice buses that were plenty big enough for the 25 of us. We had great drivers, and the South Island in particular had some really challenging driving. This is a shot of the road dropping into Milford Sound, and you can see the buses going around the switchbacks. Ian was our driver on the South Island, so he's the one who had to drive this. He was a lot of fun. So to get into the geology, the tectonic big picture is that we now have this 8th continent called Zealandia, and it's mostly submerged, except for New Zealand and New Caledonia there at the north end. It's about 2/3 the size of Australia, and a good chunk of this is thought to have been above sea level during the ice ages when sea level was quite a bit lower. But now it's sort of down to these islands. Tectonically, you have this transpressional collision coming from both directions, with oceanic crust from the northeast subducting under the North Island, coming in from the northeast, and the continental crust from the southwest more obliquely colliding with the west coast of the South Island. And so you get a mostly strikes up fault, but there's enough compression there to push up the southern Alps. So we get very different tectonic results. These maps are kind of thick. First off, I'll go over our general route, which was from Auckland down to the Taupo volcanic zone, following the blue line. We went past the Coromandel Peninsula into the Taupo volcanic zone, and then south to Wellington. And we flew to Canterbury and headed to across the southern Alps to Greymouth, and went up the coast a little, and then down south, down the coast to about Haast, and then back across the southern Alps into Otago. And then we went down to Fiordland, went over to Milford Sound, and then back and down around the southern coast and up to Dunedin, and then toured a bit north from there. On the North Island, the volcanics are sort of dominant, and then there's this mostly sedimentary cover. So there have been times in the past when even less was exposed, maybe none at times. The blue stuff that you see running through the North Island and down into the South Island, if you move over to the right-hand side, this sort of tells you what was going on at different times. And what's below this unconformity, all of these rocks were effectively accreted against Gondwana, the coast of Gondwana, and eventually what ended up Australia and New Zealand. And so the oldest rocks are basically Cambrian, maybe a little bit older in places, but you have the lower Paleozoic rocks, and then a bunch of stuff started getting accreted. So there were island arcs and maybe some seafloor, and then various accretionary complexes, sedimentary complexes. And then in the Cretaceous, it started stretching and broke apart, and that's when Zealandia formed. And then there's this Zealandia succession of rocks that you don't find in Australia. If you look at it in cross-section, what's on the left is these older rocks in the what's called the Western Province, and then all these intrusions that were probably intruding during all this time when all these Eastern Province rocks were docking, in a sense, before the breakup. In the North Island, again, here that most recent accretionary prism stuff is gray on the right-hand side, and sort of mostly sort of greenish on the left-hand geology map. But other than that, things have, basically been added on to that. The geologic map doesn't break up the quaternary, yellow quaternary stuff into sediments, between sediments and volcanic, so that's both. So we started in Auckland, which is built on effectively a field of volcanoes, and most of what you can, the eruption started quite a long time ago, but most of what you can see is either 30,000 years or less in age, and the photograph from the sky tower shows the closest mound is the most recent one. It's Rangitoto, and it erupted about 600 years ago. And the picture on the bottom, we're looking more or less in the same direction back toward downtown. You can see the sky tower there on the skyline, and here we're at about a 15,000-year-old scoria cone to the south, Mount Eden. I think I'd be kind of nervous to live there, because clearly things could start erupting any time. We headed southeast from Auckland past the Coromandel volcanic zone, where we made one stop to look at a historic gold deposit. This volcanic zone, you'll notice, is at a different angle from the Taupo volcanic zone, which is the current one. And there's some that was the arc from the volcanic arc from up until the middle of the Pliocene, and then for some reason, I don't know, things rotated or what, but it changed orientation and is now this Taupo volcanic zone. We visited 3 volcanoes in here. We were supposed to go to White Island, but of course we didn't since it, it blew up and killed people. So we ended up going to a different volcano. We also went to quite a few, or to a couple of geothermal areas. At the south end of this Taupo volcano, the northern part of the Taupo volcanic zone is dominated by caldera eruptions, which produce ignimbrites and ashfall. But at the southern end of the zone, the volcanoes transition to andesitic cones, more like what we're used to looking at here in the Pacific Northwest. Let's see. We visited 2 of the geothermal areas in the zone, and the one on the left was sort of more of a geyser and mud pot sort of field. But the other one, clearly more geochemically diverse. So these are areas where active mineralization is occurring and likely forming future gold mines. I'm not sure what's going on in this kind of pea soup green spring, but it's really interesting. On our way down to these into the Taupo zone, we stopped at one of these older fossil hot spring deposit, basically at Karangahaki, and looked at some of the rocks there. It was also a really nice hike up a lovely canyon. We stopped at a couple of Maori tourist sites. The one on the left was at that first of the geothermal areas, and this was to learn a bit about Maori culture. They had us try out some of their dances and moves. So the women got to try poi dance, which featured swinging puffy balls on a string, and that's Mary in the blue on the bottom picture. And the men got to try out their intimidating haka moves. So you get to bug out your eyes and wave your arms and yell. And apparently that all worked pretty well until Europeans showed up with guns. At the other place, I got to try out, there it is. I got to try out the ball thing, and Mary was way better at this than I was. I'm kind of hopelessly uncoordinated. But I found this a lot harder than it looks. Oops. There we go. We visited, the first volcano we visited was Mount Tarawera, and this was the substitution for White Island. But I'm not sure it wasn't more interesting. We piled into several jeeps for a wild ride up a really marginal dirt road up into a Maori reserve up on the flanks of the volcano to see where the biggest eruption in New Zealand since European settlement in the early 1800s happened. This erupted in the mid-1880s. And it erupted basalt, which covered some pre-existing rhyolitic domes. The other 2 volcanoes were at the south end of the Taupo volcanic zone, Tongariro and Ruapehu. And so these are stratovolcanoes. Both are active, and Tongariro last had some eruptive activity in 2012. However, the big hazard in the Taupo volcanic zone is the big caldera eruptions of ignimbrite and ash. This is a sign at on the left was a sign at one of the hot springs, and what's behind it is deposits from the smaller Taupo eruption they show on their figure there. And this map up in the upper right shows the limit of ignimbrite and then the ashfall. Those are 10 centimeter contours there for the ash. At the bottom is Lake Taupo itself, which I'm kind of assuming it's kind of like Yellowstone Lake, and it's filling of all caldera, and I assume this caldera formed in the big eruption of 26,500 years ago. Anyway, on that figure, at the bottom they show how big the most recent eruption of Mount Ruhapeu was in the mid-90s, the ash cloud from that, and then the ash cloud from the mid-1880s Mount Tarawera eruption, and then Mount St. Helens looks pretty small by comparison. It was big for us. And the Mount Pinatubo, which I suspect may be the biggest ash cloud of eruption of my lifetime. The other big volcanic hazard from these stratovolcanoes, of course, is lahars. And there's a map showing lahar paths over the last 20,000 years. A few days after I was born, a lahar took out a lower bridge and railroad bridge and road bridge, and it was at night, and so on Christmas Eve, and so the train wasn't able to stop in time. They had a little warning, but still couldn't stop in time, and about half the train landed in the river, and quite a few people died. I hope they've built the bridges higher on all the drainages that come off of Ruapeu. So we left the volcanic zone and headed south across some fairly impressive Plio-Pleistocene marine sediments here along this river, or cutting through sandstones and with coquina beds. And then about the time we were getting down to Wellington, we finally got to look at some of the Torles basement, which is the last of those accretionary complexes that ended up on the then coast of Gondwana. For those of us who live here in the Pacific Northwest and have been to the Olympic Peninsula, these really look familiar, if kind of older and grungier. Here they've been metamorphosed a little bit. It's low-grade metamorphism. But it looks real familiar to us. So it's your basic deep water accretionary complex. When we got to Wellington, we went up to their big viewpoint mountain and got to look back across downtown Wellington at the base of the hill that runs along where the Wellington Fault runs. And this is basically a dextral strike slip fault. It's a northern extension of the Alpine Fault system. And but like further south, there's enough of an uplift component that you get a pretty good topographic signature there. This fault goes about in a major earthquake about every 200 years, and they are overdue. So looking at the South Island geology here, all this kind of light blue stuff is the Torles, and then further south are these other older accretionary complexes that got glommed onto then Gondwana. Let's see. sorry. So one thing you may want to notice is this Dun Mountain Mai Tai complex. It's kind of this darker green that runs along the bottom there. It helps to know that the rock type dunite is named after Dun Mountain. And so then you look at that and you go, oh, that's the ophiolite zone. So that's a piece of seafloor that got mooshed up in there. The purple stuff in the southwest is those older lower Paleozoic rocks, and then all these intrusives that got into them. Looking at the geology map, you'll see that there are some. Here the Torles mainly is in this kind of medium green, and then the yellow is a big alluvial plain, and it's pretty much quaternary sediments and recent sediments. The orange blobs off Christchurch and further south off Dunedin, Port Chalmers, those are Miocene volcanoes, and they make, part of the reason those cities are there is that they make good deep water ports, the eroded portions of that. In Christchurch, once in Christchurch, we went on a bit of tour of downtown, and this is now a little over 10 years since the big shock, and they're still rebuilding pieces. Most of town looks okay, but they're still rebuilding the cathedral here. There was quite a bit of the epicenter was quite a ways to the west, but Christchurch is largely built on these quaternary sediments and deltaic deposits, and so there was probably quite a bit of liquefaction that went on. And then without the volcano next door, there may well have been some refraction of seismic waves, and then you can get interference and strong shaking one place and not so much other places. Aftershocks continued for nearly, or I think about a year. I think it was less than a year. I think I've got that wrong. And it was along this more or less east-west zone of presumably some sort of strike-slip faults there. And the centers of these aftershocks progressively moved to the east over time. We went up. The other place we toured was to go up and into this northernmost edge of the Christchurch volcanoes. There's really three of them, and they sort of overlap: the Littleton and Mount Herbert and Akaroa volcanoes. And we went up to see where we kind of a pass where we could look down into Littleton Harbor, and had lunch at a nice little cafe called Sign of the Kiwi. After the trip was over, Tamara and I came back up and at Ian's suggestion, our driver Ian, he suggested we go drive over to Akaroa and look at that volcano. The other thing to note on the geology map of the South Island is this big discontinuity along the western edge of the Torles, and that's the Alpine Fault and all this uplifted stuff in the Southern Alps. You'll note that some of the rocks from the more southerly end, some of these like the Dun Mountain group and some of these other older terrains, accretionary terrains, can be picked up again at the north end of the South Island, and that gives you some sense as to the displacement along that fault. From Christchurch, we headed sort of generally northwest across the Canterbury Plain, those quaternary sediments, which has a lot of type farms on it, and into the foothills, which are again the Torles to a large extent, and stopped at Castle Hill, which was a basin that formed in the Torles after breakup, and some limestone units were deposited and make for a really interesting terrain. Going through the Southern Alps, we crossed at Arthur's Pass, and there's, on the left is a rather kind of an icky outcrop along the road that had some, was probably along or near a splay of the Alpine Fault and had some sort of myelinatized schist in it. And the rivers, character of the rivers changed. They got a lot broader. The valleys got broader, probably had been glaciated and filled with these braided streams. Reaching the Tasman Sea coast, we headed north and went to Punakaiki Rocks, which are another big tourist location. They're Oligocene thinly bedded carbonates where the bedding's been enhanced by stylites. And so you get dissolution and concentration of other stray minerals that have landed in there along the bedding plains. On our way back to Greymouth, we also looked at, I didn't put in a picture, but we looked at some Ordovician Greenland group rocks. Now we're on the Australian plate, so we're seeing rocks that have an affinity to Australia. Anyway, we saw clasts in a conglomerate. It would have been hard to go look at an actual outcrop, I think. In Greymouth, we stayed at a top 10 holiday park right along the coast, and with a very nice beach. We finally had some really nice clear skies, and I still kick myself that I didn't go out that night and look at the stars more, because this picture on the right, I'm looking north at the moon, and the moon is heading toward the sunset over on our left. And so it's like everything that we see from the northern hemisphere is somehow upside down and backward, like Orion is upside down and moving the wrong way, and Sirius is on the wrong side. Anyway, it was fascinating to look at the night sky down there. Heading south from Greymouth, we stopped at Hokitika, which is famous for its nephrite jade and has quite a few shops where some of us parted with a fair amount of money buying jewelry. We visited one where they allowed us to tour part of their processing area. Nephrite forms inclusions in serpentinite along the Alpine Fault and comes down the river in boulders. Since it's made of tremolite, actinolite type minerals, it's basically a nasty form of asbestos, and so I sort of wondered about the safety of the workers. But I suppose as long as they keep everything wet, either with water or oil, it's probably fairly safe. One of the main highlights of this trip was our chance to go tour the Alpine Fault at Gaunt Creek. This is on private land, so it's another tour that you take to live your only chance in the world to stand astride two major continents. But those of us from the West Coast know that you can also do that along the San Andreas Fault in places. I had a bad foot, so I didn't clamber up to see this greenish fault gouge zone, but most of us did. So what's below that is Australian plate, and what's above it is Pacific plate being shoved up, along with moving strike slip. This fault area is instrumented, and our guide Elizabeth opened up one of the vaults so that we could see some of their equipment. there's been quite a bit of debris from damage from a debris flow that came down that drainage a few years ago, but I think at least some of this is still functional. The tour office had a really nice block display of the Alpine Fault, showing both the strike slip with the Australian plate going in and the Pacific plate seeming to come out at us, as well as sort of the reverse fault components. And we decided this was a really good place for our official group picture. And so you can see how big a group we were. Our last stop of that day before we got to Haast, where we'd leave the coast, was to the beach at Bruce Bay, where the river is dumping a whole bunch of garnet and magnetite sand. And then I think the wave action then continues to sort that and really concentrate it in layers in the beach deposits. I studied sediments, and this is one of the most amazing sands I've ever seen. I took a sample of it, and to really get a good look at it, and it really is a really high percentage of just garnet and magnetite. There may be other things like ilmenite and stuff like that in there too. And one can imagine that somebody could mine it in the future. From Haast, we headed back across the Southern Alps through a more clearly glaciated landscape than we'd seen farther north going over Arthur's Pass, and crossed over the divide at the gates of Haast. We also stopped at a place called along Pivot Creek to look at the wide variety of schists in the river cobbles. The creek drains an area where intrusives have come into the regional schist and added contact metamorphism to the mix, and so you can see there's looks like epidote alteration in some of these rocks. We did a more touristy, scenic stop and did a quick hike to the appropriately named Blue Hole at the confluence of the Makaror and Blue Rivers. And that was really pretty, and the vegetation was really nice too, very, very interesting. Ferns and mosses and stuff. Leaving the mountains, we came into central Otago. And this is an area of extensional tectonics over the past few million years, and it's underlain by schist, and so the ranges are schist, and the downdrop valleys are either filled with sediment or they got glaciated, and so there are these effectively glacial lakes in them. The rest of us were stuffing our faces with lunch, but Anila had to really experience one of these lakes. We're also sitting in the rain shadow of the Southern Alps, so this is the driest part of New Zealand. And the landscape is really reminiscent of north-central Washington and kind of south-central BC. And not surprisingly, it's also a major wine grape growing area. So when you enjoy your nice New Zealand wine, the grapes probably were grown somewhere around here. This is also an area where many of the towns started as gold mining towns, probably at placer deposits or along rivers. We visited a couple of old abandoned workings at Bendigo. The gold is in quartz veins and breccias along shear zones in the schist. So this was a hard rock mining site. The gold in placer deposits probably eroded out of deposits like this. Bannockburn was one of the first major gold discoveries in New Zealand, starting in the 1860s. And it's effectively a fossil placer deposit from the Pleistocene. Some river deposited all this in the Pleistocene. And it was worked hydraulically until about 1900. We also made a tourist stop for several intrepid people to do the famous shot over river boat ride. The rest of us entertained ourselves by examining the schist cobbles on the point bar where the boats launch. I was really impressed by the purple schists, which Paul figured were originally manganese-bearing schists or something like that. We ended up at Te Anau, which is where my opening slide was taken. From there, we went to Milford Sound to do the boat tour. Only buses with permission can go there, and we have to travel in convoys along this very spectacular road that was built during the Great Depression. This took us through some of the oldest rocks in New Zealand, but we couldn't stop to look at them, being in a convoy. However, the glacial features were really spectacular. Unfortunately, the weather had continued showery, so we couldn't see the peaks. The upside, though, was that we got to see lots of fabulous waterfalls, both along our drive and on Milford Sound. This is where the boat went below one of the waterfalls and had invited people to go up and experience them, the waterfall shower experience. And my picture in the early on of Tom was post-waterfall shower. Must have been exhilarating. I didn't do it. From Te Anau, we continued south through the rain to the south coast, where there's kind of a wide mix of rock types, and I think things are so broken up by later cover that I had a hard time getting a clear sense of why what was where. And but we saw some Cretaceous gabbros along the south coast near Monkey Island. As you can see, our rain was continuing, and it looks to me like a layered gabbro. And then we also stopped to see some petrified trees from the middle Jurassic deposit. A couple of people on the trip, after it was over, rented a car and went down and looked at this again and got there in nice weather and at a much lower tide and said it was a lot more spectacular then. Tides make a difference. We also got to see a lot of livestock in this area. Sheep, both for lamb and wool, is a major industry in New Zealand, but we also saw a lot of cattle. I didn't manage to get a picture of any of the deer farms we passed, and there were quite a few. Venison is a major farmed meat in New Zealand, and dinner menus typically offer it. So it was here deer are wild, and it was hard to imagine that you can fence them in and not have them just jump over and leave. Once we got to Dunedin on the east coast, the weather started to improve. We went further up the coast to see the Moriraki boulders, which are giant concretions that have weathered out along the beach from Paleocene mudstones. And these things really are huge. And then we came back down the coast toward Port Chalmers, which is Dunedin's deepwater port. And on our way, we stopped to look at some of the sediments, probably Oligocene, underlying this Miocene volcano. And this is Lisa Trenell, who was our AWG president at the time. She's now past president. This was also this was the best beach we saw for shells, and the kind of conical snails there, turritellid type snails. Those are, I don't have any scale on here, but they ran 1 to 2 inches long to give you a sense of the size of everything. But the beach was just littered with these things. Our last night in Dunedin, we toured the Spates Brewery and had our final dinner in the restaurant there and got to thank Paul and Tom. The next morning, most of the group headed off to the airport and flew back up to Auckland. But Tamara and I continued on stayed up for an extra 4 days, and Tamara rented a car in Dunedin and bravely drove it. They have left-hand drive like England, so that's kind of exciting. And we went up on a mountain near Dunedin, and where we could get a nice overlook of the city. Back in Christchurch, we toured Akaroa, and so we drove out to this road. Akaroa is on the east side of Akaroa Harbor, but we took the windy, maybe you can see it, red road at the top, which runs along the crest. And I'm not normally a nervous passenger, but I spent a lot of that drive hanging on to the door handle with kind of white knuckles because it was a paved road, but it was really pretty narrow. And we had these glorious views down into all these little bays and harbors that have eroded into the old volcano. And so this one on the bottom right is, I think, Pigeon Bay, and then the upper right, we're looking down at Akaroa Harbor, and Akaroa Town is kind of on the left side of the picture. You can see that's a cruise boat there. So Akaroa itself is a cute little Victorian town, which is kind of overrun by tourists, I think. But it was a really beautiful drive. So Ian was right. So thank you, and I'll take questions.